Welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today, we're embarking on a really deep dive into a truly fundamental question. How has philosophy wrestled with the nature of human consciousness, thinking, the external world, and, the search for reality itself?
And to guide us, we're using excerpts from Rudolf Steiner's The Riddle of Philosophy. These sources, they give us this incredible panoramic view, really,
Yeah.
showing just how differently these core questions, who are we, where do we fit, have been approached across the ages, especially as the modern scientific view of the world began to take shape.
Absolutely. We're going to explore how thinkers perceive thought itself, how that connection between, say, the human soul and the world seemed to change, maybe even fray over centuries.
Right, and the various ways people try to understand or bridge that gap, this growing separation, really, between our inner life and a world increasingly defined by, well, external nature and scientific law.
It sounds like a journey filled with some pretty surprising shifts in perspective.
Definitely. And it might just give you a whole new way to look at your own thinking, how you experience the world around you.
Okay, let's dive in then. We start in ancient Greece, which is, it's the absolutely crucial starting point for this story, isn't it?
Totally essential.
Now, one of the most striking things the sources highlight is this core difference in how the ancient Greeks experienced thought compared to, well, us today.
That's right. It's easy to gloss over, but it's such a profound insight into their consciousness. They didn't experience thought primarily as something happening purely inside their heads, generated by their individual minds.
Okay, so how did they experience it?
For them, the experience of thinking was much more akin to a perception.
A perception, like seeing a color or hearing a sound. Is that what you mean?
Exactly like that. Think about seeing the color red on that book over there. You perceive the color in the book, right? Adhering to the object.
Uh-huh.
The Greeks experienced thought as something perceived in the world of things, attached to them, almost woven into them.
Wow. So thought wasn't separate from the world. It was like part of the world's fabric that they could actually perceive.
Precisely. And this made thought the natural living connection between the soul and the world. This whole separation process we feel now, it was just beginning then, not complete at all.
So the soul felt the thought inside, but felt it came from the world.
Exactly. They received these thoughts from the world. And they looked to this direct thought experience for answers to the world's riddles.
And we see this evolving through those early figures the sources mention, like Pherecydes, Thales.
Right. Pherecydes trying to grasp origins through thought, not just, old myths. Thales seeing water as the key, Anaximander the infinite, and Anaximenes air.
Heraclitus with fire and flux. That feeling of the soul in the stream of becoming. The source mentions that phrase, everything has everything else in itself.
Yeah, and it's key, like the text points out, that just looking at their theories about nature based on what we call imperfect observation misses the point.
How
It misses this deeper experience they had of thought as a living perception woven into nature. For Thales, water wasn't just something you see changing. Its processes felt somehow continuous with his own inner soul life.
Okay, that sets the stage for a major shift, though. The sources bring in Pythagoras. He seems like a turning point towards something more intellectual.
He is. He saw thought originating in the soul. He felt this sense of the soul kind of descending into itself.
And because of that,
Because of that, he didn't think that ordinary thought, as he felt it, could reach the highest truths, the ultimate origins. He sought that highest knowledge in a sphere beyond thought.
beyond thought. But where?
Still within the soul's own potential, its own development. He found that connection to the world's harmony through numbers, not just math, but things like musical proportions, an experience of cosmic order within the soul.
So, seeking reality beyond thought, but by going deeper within, that's a really crucial distinction, isn't it? Compared to what happens later.
Absolutely critical. Then we get Socrates. Huge emphasis on cultivating the right thoughts, especially about virtue.
The sources quote him saying something like, what matters is having the right thoughts about virtue. And that virtue makes you more valuable when you experience it in thought.
Exactly. He's building confidence in the soul's power through its thinking activity, trusting that inner experience of thought.
And this whole trajectory, this Greek development, it culminates in Plato, right? The sources call him the climax.
The absolute climax of this period's thought life. He takes that Socratic confidence in thinking and reaches this incredible insight that in the life of thought itself, the world spirit reveals its true being.
So for Plato, thinking wasn't just about reality, it was where reality showed itself.
Precisely. Nothing had real value unless the soul brought it into the light of thought. Philosophy, for him, became the science of ideas.
And these ideas aren't just concepts in our heads.
Not at all. They are the true, eternal world of being. They're the manifestation of the world spirit, revealed through human thinking. The physical world we see, it's just a reflection, like shaky reflections of stars in water.
The ideas are the real stars.
Exactly. They're the reality, acting on each other, shaping the imperfect physical world.
And his idea of the soul fits this, being part of that world of ideas.
Yes, the rational soul belongs there. Though when it's earthbound, it seems threefold, connected to courage and appetite, acknowledging its temporary link to the body, but its essence is in that higher world.
And this way of thinking, Platonic, Pythagorean, it didn't just disappear after Plato.
No, it continued for centuries, influencing figures the sources mentioned like Plotinus, Proclus, others. This sense of thought connecting us to a deeper reality persisted.
Okay, so that's the foundation. Thought perceived in the world, a bridge to spirit. What happens next? How does this change?
Well, the text describes this Greek way of experiencing thought, gradually, exhausting itself. Running out of steam, maybe. But underneath that, something more fundamental is happening in the human soul. The slow, gradual emergence of what we call ego consciousness, the sense of being a separate I.
Ah, the modern self.
Exactly. By the Middle Ages, especially after the first half, people are confronted more directly with this developed ego consciousness. And this brings totally new riddles of life.
Because the old way doesn't quite fit anymore.
Right. That old experience of thought as a living perception in the world, it's fading. Compared to the Greek soul, thought feels more internal, more abstract, maybe even thinner.
And this leads to a big shift in how people search for reality.
Huge shift. There's still this deep human drive to go beyond ordinary thinking, to grasp reality, just like Pythagoras or Plotinus wanted to.
But the method changes.
Completely. Instead of seeking that reality by developing something within the soul, like the ancients did, the assumption now tends to be that this deeper reality must approach the soul from the outside.
So the search turns outward, towards nature, or maybe God conceived as external.
Exactly. Towards the physical world or a transcendent realm thought of as separate. And we start seeing thinkers really wrestling with this new situation, this widening gap between the inner self-aware ego and an external world that doesn't feel inherently spiritual or full of thought anymore.
Like Paracelsus, who the sources mention seeking a higher nature behind nature.
Yes, and notice his approach. He doesn't retreat inward like an ancient mystic. He wants to use his ego, his self-consciousness, to penetrate nature's processes, to find the spirit under the surface of the physical world itself.
And Giordano Bruno. He needed a world picture where his own ego, his I, could actually be real.
Which led him to that idea of the world being made of monads, fundamental self-contained entities. If only a monad can be truly real, he reasoned, then everything, including his own ego, must be a monad with its own inner qualities.
So you start to see different strategies emerging for dealing with this new situation.
Definitely. On one hand, you get figures like Francis Bacon, really emphasizing the external world. The text says Bacon pointed to a method based on observing individual natural things.
To derive general ideas from them, focusing on gathering the materials from outside.
Right. But the sources are pretty critical of this, at least for building a whole world conception.
Why is that?
The critique is basically that Bacon didn't realize you need different tools now. Just observing the stones of external facts isn't enough to build the house of a worldview. The general ideas, the organizing principles, they need to flash up from the ground of being in the soul. You can't just get them from looking outside.
Okay, so Bacon's focused on the materials. Then, in stark contrast, you have René Descartes. He focuses on the plan, right? On inner certainty. The sources call this a move of most telling significance.
Absolutely pivotal. Descartes approaches everything with this radical systematic doubt, strips away everything he could doubt to find what's absolutely certain.
And what does he find?
He finds his own doubting activity. I doubt, therefore I think. I think, therefore I am. Cogito ergo sum.
The famous line.
The famous line. In that act of radical doubt, the self-conscious ego asserts its own undeniable reality. It conquers the right to recognize its own being. The I becomes the rock-solid starting point for all knowledge.
And Spinoza then takes this idea of certainty rooted in thought and builds a whole system from it.
He does. He asks, where do we start building a true picture of the world? And he lands on substance, something needing nothing else for its being, which he identifies with God or nature.
And his method is like math.
Yeah, he models it on geometry, starting from general truths created or grasped by the ego. There's one substance, but it has attributes we can access. Extension, the physical world, and thinking, the inner world.
And humans have both.
Right, body and soul. So when we think or act, it's ultimately the divine substance acting through us. This means freedom is relative, kind of like a stone's motion is determined. He built his whole world picture purely out of thoughts whose certainty rests on that self-consciousness.
So whether starting from the ego's bare existence like Descartes, or thought's own certainty like Spinoza, the focus is inward, building out from the self.
And Leibniz is similar in a way, trying to justify the ego's place in the world. Kind of like Bruno, he needs a world picture where the self-conscious ego can be real.
So he builds a picture completely formed out of the ego itself.
That's the idea. For Leibniz, truth isn't found just by looking outside. It's constructed based on the ego's inner nature, its structure. His monads, the soul monad linked to body monads, reflect this attempt to build reality from self-contained, ego-like principles.
It really sounds like a profound effort to establish the ego's independence and figure out its place, working primarily from that inner experience of self.
It is. And then you see figures like Herder. He's influenced by Leibniz, but he shows what the source calls this emerging soul impulse of the modern age. He doesn't just build a system from an abstract idea of the ego.
What does he do differently?
He's convinced the right picture emerges when the soul approaches things in a healthy way, with its full living force, not just intellectually. He echoes Goethe's idea that every element of fact is already theory.
So he feels that what the Greeks experienced as thought out there in the world has to become an inner soul experience now.
That's exactly it. The big question becomes, how do I reach deep enough into my own soul to find that connection with the world's foundation so my thoughts aren't just my thoughts, but actually express the world's creative forces? This really sets the stage for a lot of the challenges to come.
Which brings us right to the end of the 18th century, a period the sources highlight with figures like Kant and Goethe, calling them new peaks of insight.
Hugely pivotal figures, yeah. People like Fichte looked up to them immensely. Immanuel Kant famously tried to define the limits of what we can actually know intellectually.
To make place for belief, right?
Exactly. Belief in things like God, freedom, immortality. He argued that real science was only possible where mathematics could be applied. He was tackling challenges from people like Hume, who basically said knowledge is just mental habits, not necessarily real.
So Kant pushes back. How?
His big contribution was showing that the fundamental structure of our knowledge, things like cause and effect, space and time, they actually originate within our own self-conscious soul and the structure of our minds. The certainty of these basic laws comes from us, not just passively from nature.
But the source points out a major limitation in Kant, too.
He does, and it notes he kind of throws up his hands when it comes to the living organism in nature. He couldn't really imagine thoughts being actively present in nature's processes themselves.
Why not?
The text suggests that to perceive thought active in nature, the soul would need to somehow share the life of nature through inner experience, not just observe it like an outsider. Kant didn't go there, leaving this gap between the knowing eye and the living world.
And then, contrasted with Kant, you have Goethe, described as having a strictly unitary world conception.
Yeah, Goethe saw everything as interconnected. One set of laws governing the whole universe, from a falling brick to, like, poetic inspiration. And crucially, he disagreed with the idea that nature's truth was found outside of us, like in Newtonian physics.
He thought nature's peak was in humans.
He felt nature reached its highest expression in humanity. The sources quote those lines. Nature has neither core nor shell. Nature herself is one and all. And then that challenge. Better search yourself once more, whether you be crust or core. For Goethe, understanding nature was tied up with understanding yourself.
These two, Kant and Goethe, with such different approaches, really set the agenda for the next phase, didn't they?
Absolutely. Steiner's text shows how their questions, their unfinished business, became the starting points for successors like Fichte and Schelling. They were trying to restore knowledge to its full power, aiming to satisfy our deepest needs through understanding the world.
Fichte, starting from Kant's focus on the I, believed our highest self comes from engaging deeply with the ego.
Yeah, he felt our true purpose, our vocation, is realized when we become aware of consciously living in the supersensible, a realm beyond the senses. Experiencing this pure I is what makes you a philosopher. He even called for developing a completely new inner sense organ to perceive this world.
Though he didn't fully spell out what that organ sees.
Not really. And then you have Schiller leaning more towards Goethe's view. He saw modern people as having lost an earlier sensual harmony. We're now driven by this striving for unity, trying to bridge the gap between our perception and our thought, which has become an ideal we have to work towards.
So these figures, Goethe, Fichte's, Schiller, they represent what the source calls the experienced idea. Is that right?
Idea experience, yeah. Finding truth through immediate intercourse with the real world, not just abstract logic or looking outside.
Which is different from the Greek perceived idea perception, where the idea was felt in the world.
Exactly. This modern approach blends, poetic imagination with philosophy. It emphasizes the personal element, the unique insight a genius creates, like Jean-Paul said. It's not about a fixed, finished picture like Kant might have aimed for.
And Schelling. He took Fichte's higher sense idea and connected it to imagination.
He called it intellectual imagination, the power to produce thoughts that grasp nature's deep patterns. And he made a really bold move.
What was that?
He argued that nature must realize the laws of our own spirit. Nature is to be the visible spirit the invisible nature. Where Kant put limits on knowing the transcendent, Schelling said, no, our observation and thinking are the divine at work in the world.
So Fichte put everything into the ego.
Schelling kind of spread this ego over everything. He saw the whole human spirit, the personality, as divine. The source calls this anthropomorphism, using Goethe's sense of the term, meaning our way of understanding nature is inevitably shaped by our own inner human form.
Okay, so we've gone from thought in the world to thought from the ego, with thinkers trying to build reality out of the ego or see the ego's structure in the world. Now we hit the 19th century, and boom, the rise of natural science changes everything.
Fundamentally alters the whole conversation. Thinkers are now confronted with the sheer success of scientific methods in explaining the external world. It's unavoidable.
Hegel, early in the century, seems to capture this modern consciousness. The Greeks knew thought as perception. Moderns know it as self-generated within.
Right. Hegel starts with self-consciousness, like Descartes, but then sees it uniting with the world's spirit through a dynamic process. The modern thinker, for Hegel, lives inside the world's creative unfolding, finds himself there, and hears the world's spirit speaking within his own self-consciousness.
So it's not like Plato contemplating static ideas?
No, Hegel's soul actively immerses itself in the process. He even saw the state as a stage in this unfolding, as realized thought, where individuals find their truth and morality by being part of that larger whole.
But not everyone bought into Hegel's grand system.
Oh, definitely not. You get reactions like Herbart. He totally opposed Hegel's dynamic dialectic. He wanted a world of simple, unchanging entities.
And we don't perceive the entities themselves.
Nope, only their relations. The soul itself is just one of these simple entities. Our inner life thoughts, feelings are just the results of these relations. His psychology became almost like math and arithmetical operation.
The source isn't too keen on Herbart, calls him reactionary.
Yeah, it finds his view inadequate for the dynamism of the age, struggles to account for human action, art, spiritual striving. Ethics and aesthetics get reduced to just feelings of pleasure or displeasure about certain relationships between ideas or wills.
And while these philosophers are debating, natural science is just taking off.
Huge strides. Oersted, Faraday with electricity and magnetism, Mayer with energy conservation.
Yeah.
These weren't just technical things. They deeply impacted how people thought about reality. It got harder and harder to maintain a purely spirit-first picture.
Concepts like a special life force or inherent purpose in nature seemed less necessary.
Exactly. When physical and chemical laws seemed to explain so much, those ideas became harder to defend scientifically.
And right into this comes Darwinism.
A game changer. Darwin offered a way to explain the appearance of design in nature, how organisms fit their environment so well, using principles like physics and chemistry use, without needing a designer or conscious intention.
Natural selection explains how things can look purposeful without being intended.
Precisely. And the sources link this to embryology too, like Fritz Müller showing how similar early embryos suggest common descent.
This must have fueled massive debates.
Huge debates about life, reality, everything. Look at the Virchow versus Hegel clash. Hegel, kind of like Goethe, trusted nature's consistency and was ready to extend scientific principles into a full worldview. He even wrote monism as a bond between religion and science.
Seeing science as the worldview.
Right, and his view is presented as the polar opposite of Hegel's, isn't it?
Seems like it. Hegel starts with the idea, gets nature from spirit. Hegel starts with nature's facts, tries to get spirit from nature.
Exactly. Hegel. Human spirit is the climax. Hegel, human activity points back to simple material origins. Hegel even looked for proto-spirit in inorganic stuff, attraction-repulsion, as basic sensation will. And he saw evolution as a real ascent, creating genuinely new things, not just unfolding a plan.
This whole atmosphere really pushes materialism forward, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The success of science made it seem like the most plausible framework for many thinkers trying to understand the soul and consciousness.
Like David Strauss, using historical and scientific critique on religion.
Yeah, he took Hegel's idea of the divine revealed in spirit, but controversially said that perfection is in the whole human race, not just one person like Jesus. The human race is God made flesh. Caused quite the uproar.
And Ludwig Feuerbach goes even further. Man's nature is also his supreme being.
Feuerbach saw God as an illusion, man projecting his own best qualities outward. His goal was to strip away those illusions, basically forced by the scientific picture of nature, to explain away anything in the soul that didn't fit.
Then there's Max Stirner, who critiques even the critics. There must by no means be any dogma. This is his dogma.
Huh. Yeah, Stirner distrusted any fixed system, even critical ones. He emphasized the living process of thought. For him, the personality, the unique ego, is the source of everything. Morality, those are just self-set aims.
So you love your neighbor because your ego drives you to.
That was his provocative take. Not because of some commandment. He thought a moral order would just emerge from people following their own unique nature. Faced with this stark reality of the self-conscious ego, Stirner focuses on expressing that living ego itself, finding its core in will activity. Maybe, he suggests, the will is the source of the world.
It sounds like, faced with this seemingly cold scientific world, some thinkers tried to find the soul's reality in the will, or the unique self.
That's a good way to put it. But this scientific focus also led down another path, questioning if we can even trust our own perception of the world, or even our knowledge.
How did science feed into that?
Well, think about physics saying color isn't in the object, it's just motion. Or physiology saying a nerve just reports its own state, not the external thing itself. It makes your experience feel very subjective, a product of your own makeup.
Which leads to someone like Hippolyte Taine.
Yeah, Taine makes that really radical claim. External perception is nothing but hallucination. The only certainty is your consciousness of the inner image, the phantom. You can't even be sure if it matches anything outside. Even touch could be part of the hallucination.
Wow. That sounds close to agnosticism.
Very close. People like T.H. Huxley argued we just can't know the unknowable beyond our senses and intellect. Our tools are limited.
Friedrich Albert Lange seems to agree on those limits.
Lange was convinced science had to stick strictly to senses and intellect, and he accepted that these tools only give us a result shaped by our own organization. His conclusion: the world we experience is a product of the fiction of our senses and of our intellects.
So no knowing the world's essence for Lange.
Not through those means, no. Anything beyond that idealist philosophy claims about spiritual reality he called mere fiction, which also meant morality couldn't be rooted in any objective reality we could know.
Herbert Spencer also divided things into the knowable science part and the unknowable belief part.
Right, which offered a way to keep both science and, maybe, religious feeling. But it contrasts sharply with idealists who thought knowledge could reach the world's core. Spencer famously took the idea of evolution and applied it everywhere: cosmos, life, psychology, seeing it as this universal principle of development.
And you also had positivism with Kant, trying to build everything just on science, rejecting introspection, aiming for mathematical laws.
Yeah, Kant wanted a world understood purely through observable facts and scientific laws. He was so strict he even rejected evolution theory initially, because fixed species fit his model better at the time.
But amid all this focus on science and limits, people were still trying to find a place for the soul, right?
Oh, absolutely. That riddle just wouldn't go away. Despite science, despite the doubts about knowledge, the question of the soul persisted.
Like Hermann Lotze, he saw personality and ethical purpose guiding the world.
He did. He viewed natural laws as just the outer shell of an all-pervading ethical order. He believed souls continued after death, and that natural processes were just a dull, transitory appearance of a deeper, active, moral reality centered on personality, trying to bridge that gap again.
And Gustav Fechner, a scientist who still looked beyond the senses.
Yeah, the sources say that while he was a scientist, the sensory world actually stimulated him to imagine realities beyond just perception. He felt it hinted at more. He even developed psychophysics, trying to scientifically measure the soul's responses but still believed in more than just the measurable.
Franz Brentano seems to represent the struggle, though trying empirical psychology but finding it hard to tackle the big soul questions that way.
Exactly. His difficulty really highlights the core problem of the time. Thinkers were trying to fit the soul into the scientific picture, but the concepts often felt inadequate. They lacked the strength to really solve the deep riddles.
So you end up with Hegel saying the soul is just a higher natural process.
Or others saying the world is basically an illusion created by our limited human setup.
Robert Zimmerman captured it. Knowledge is to conceive without conceptions. The soul sails without knowing what it is.
And Gideon Spicker doubted thinking itself. That thinking in itself is correct, we can never know for sure. That's some serious doubt setting in.
But Hermann Hammerling pushes back, finding an anchor in the will.
He felt the will clinging to existence was more real, more truthful than science's judgments. He talked about a spiritual point of gravity in the soul anchoring the ego, and criticized philosophy's sophistry against the ego.
He believed what the spirit has not experienced, it is also incapable of thinking.
Yeah, suggesting maybe modern concepts were actually blocking access to deeper soul experiences. Like Steiner, he points to will activity as the ego's core, maybe even the world source.
But Wilhelm Wundt, grappling with the same things, didn't find the will solved everything.
Wundt focused on the will, too, as central to experience, but felt it didn't ultimately answer the big questions about the soul's place or its continuity.
So this intense struggle to reconcile the inner self, the outer world, and science leads to some new directions towards the end of this journey.
It does. The persistent challenge remained. How do you get deep enough into the self-conscious ego to find that connection to the source of existence, something beyond just the nature science describes?
Pragmatism comes up here, William James and others. It sounds like a reaction against relying purely on thought.
Very much so. A disbelief in the power of thought alone, as the source puts it. Thought's job isn't ultimate truth. It's to serve action, help us navigate the world of facts effectively. Knowledge becomes a product of the will guiding our practical life.
So the ego gets lost in doing things, rather than finding itself through thinking.
Kind of. It aligns well with the scientific method focus on what works, what's verifiable, what's useful.
But alongside that, there were still attempts to carve out space for spirit or freedom against determinism.
Right. Like Emile Boutroux. He introduced contingency into nature. Natural laws aren't absolute iron clamps, he argued, more like statistical habits. This leaves room for spontaneous activity.
Which helps the soul how?
It secures a space for freedom. The soul isn't just a product of laws. It can add its own spontaneous contributions from its own nature. Understanding nature's potential for freedom helps understand the soul.
And Henri Bergson, he wanted a different kind of thinking altogether.
Bergson argued for transforming thinking into intuitive perception, a way of knowing that could directly grasp the flowing reality of life, or duration. He felt the soul experiences itself as not just a physical process. Memory for him was purely psychic, not bodily. He looked at science and argued it didn't actually disprove an independent spiritual life.
Wilhelm Dilthey also insisted on an independent spiritual world found in culture and history.
Yes, he knew science well, but argued reality wasn't just the physical. He found this independent spiritual realm alive in human cultures, arts, history, the human sciences.
And Rudolf Steiner sounds like a strong voice for this spiritual world, too.
Very strong. Eucken argued science is one-sided if it claims to be the only reality. You actually need the experience of spirit, he felt, to make sense of nature itself. He started from the soul's inner feeling of its own spontaneous work and creation. The soul actively shapes experience, feels spiritual impulses, participates in a real spiritual world.
Yeah.
He saw this spiritual life embodied in civilizations and human creations.
Max de Soir also defended spirit using things like hypnotism, but the source adds a note of caution.
The caution is, if you explain weird phenomena using just the tools of ordinary consciousness, you haven't necessarily proven a supersensible reality, especially if you think ordinary consciousness isn't up to grasping reality's core anyway. To really access the supersensible the source implies, you might need a supersensible way of thinking.
Even relativity theory gets a mention, making space and time relative, which apparently led some to feel an impotence of inner life.
Yeah, if even space and time aren't fixed, where's the solid ground? For some, it just reinforced the idea that if you want something substantial, something absolute, you have to look to the spirit, not fluctuating physical nature.
Wow. Okay, so we've traced this incredible arc. From thought felt in the world, this natural bridge.
To thought generated by the individual ego, the separate self. And then, as science paints this powerful but maybe external mechanistic picture, the soul starts to feel, well, estranged, cut off almost.
And the search for reality shifts too, from finding it in the world, like the Greeks, to grounding it in the ego, Descartes, to this modern struggle to find a connection beyond ordinary thought and scientific observation.
Yeah. Science gave us amazing tools for the external world, but it created this huge challenge for understanding the soul's place, its real nature.
Mhm.
People wrestled. Is the world knowable? Is it just an illusion? Is the soul just biology or something more?
It really leaves us with this persistent central riddle, doesn't it? How does this self-conscious ego, which feels so central to us, connect meaningfully to everything else? Where do we find certainty about ourselves and reality?
Exactly. And as we saw, some thinkers were hinting at paths beyond just analyzing or observing. What if, as Steiner's own perspective seems to suggest, philosophy needs to evolve from being mainly a study to becoming more of an experience?
You mean like developing those inner capacities, that new inner sense organ Fichte called for, or Bergson's intuition, finding that missing link through direct inner work?
It certainly raises that question. How do we bridge that gap between our inner sense of self and the vast reality described by science, a reality that often feels silent about consciousness and meaning?
Which leaves us with a pretty provocative thought to chew on as we finish this deep dive. Here it is. If our ordinary thinking, the kind tied to our senses and brain, seems to hit a wall when trying to fully grasp the soul and its place in the cosmos, then what kind of experience, maybe a development of that intuitive perception or some other inner capacity, might actually be necessary to reveal the soul's true nature and its fundamental connection to the source of all existence?